Hi guys, and welcome to the GMBN Podcast. This one is a festive feeling as we sat down with our Christmas jumpers and a nice cold beer to discuss the past decade of tech. Now, joining me, we had our very own Steve Jones and Andrew Dodd. Now, for those of you that don't know, these two have both got encyclopedic knowledge of the mountain bikes that we ride and the mountain bike industry. And they were absolute fantastic candidates to be pitching about the tech that shaped our decade of mountain biking. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you can, of course, enjoy it in all its visual glory of woolly jumper fiasco, or you can listen to it on your podcast streaming service of choice, be it Spotify, Deezer, Apple, whatever. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy what was a really fun conversation. So looking at this past decade, who is the most forward-thinking or progressive brand? Not necessarily a brand that got it right every time, but a brand that certainly wasn't afraid to try new things. If we start with you, Doddy.
It's pretty easy for me. I talk about them quite a lot. It's Mondraker. By no accounts did they get it completely right, but when they launched forward geometry in like 2012, bearing in mind that the average stem length on mountain bikes was around 70mm back then, you might get a 50 for the adventurous riders. They went straight in with a 10mm and chucked 60mm on the front centre of the bikes, in combination with some other stuff, of course. And that was largely down to Cesar Rojo, who helped sort of pioneer that, and Fabian Burrell working with them. And it was really ballsy to do it. And if you rode one of those bikes in the early days, like the angles, it had quite a steep head angle, about 67, so it wasn't that sort of slack, really, by all accounts. But it was insane. And the fact that they went straight in whole hog, all in, no kissing. Other manufacturers started jumping in 10mm at a time. Yep. They went as far as they dared go. And they've actually come back since to about 30. And really, I can only put that down to the fact that it's really hard to get your bar position and other things right with a 10mm stem.
Yep.
And it's too different to jump between that and other bikes. But I think taking a gamble and doing that, I think it's amazing.
I mean, Mondraker, they definitely, they were, like as we're saying, very forward thinking. And I think as a mass producer of bikes, there was a big case.
If you look at it, you 10 years later, and people are still catching up with Mondraker.
Yes.
Yeah. And what Cesar and Fabian have done is I agree with you, Doddy, pretty massive.
I mean, of course, the bikes aren't pretty either. I'm sure they won't mind me saying this.
Not pretty.
Those early ones were pretty hounding, and I've still got one, and I'll bring it in at some point.
I mean,
it's a large, and it's still bigger than most XLs. It's insane.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add another brand to the mix, but to continue on the Mondraker, I mean, their first summon was the aluminium bike was £32 for the downhill bike.
Yes.
Everybody was trying to make these lightweight carbon bikes, but £32.
Isn't that where we are now?
And when I rode it, I was like, oh my god, this thing is ridiculous. Yeah. But I'm going to bring into the mix, Doddy. I think YT. I mean, I rode their downhill bikes back, 2009, 2010. I thought, wow, these bikes are like seriously good, and they're like €2,000 for the bike. And they brought a different business model to the market. They got people to buy bikes differently.
Remember the adverts when it first came out?
Yeah, they were very different adverts, and the bikes were quality. And I said, continually when I worked for the magazine, it was bike of the year, 100%, because the performance on it, the value of it, the geometry, everything was amazing. And I said to Marcus and Stefan and YT, I said, guys, it's okay, me saying the bike of the year, blah, 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 but what you need is a guy to go and win the World Cup Series on that bike. Yeah. And I had the conversation in a cellar in Spain. I said, well, there's only one guy to get, Aaron Gwyn. They went and got Aaron Gwyn, and they won the World Cup Series twice, I think, right? So I think in terms
That's proving a bike straight out.
Exactly. It needed proving. They came from nowhere, and 10 years later, they're a hell of a brand.
But also I think in the years that Aaron Gwyn did, really champion the overall, he had some amazing, I'm thinking of the year he beat Danny Hart, even though Danny won the last 3 rounds. The year that it was going toe-to-toe with Greg Minnaar. And it was real vintage racing. And I think that kind of really strengthened their cause.
But I think when it came... I think one of the most impressive pieces of tech for me of the decade is a brand's ability or a person's ability to work out the correct stiffness and flex balance of a bike. It's incredibly difficult to get that feeling.
And we're going to get onto that. Don't you worry.
No, but I'll bring it onto a brand that is progressive.
Okay, go on.
And I will talk about it in depth later, is Antidote from southern Poland.
Yeah,
a brand by a guy, George Dabrowski. So I think in terms of brands, for me, in terms of progressivity of a bikes, that's for me the one.
Yeah, I think you both, the first 2 nominations are very, very, very strong. And I think Antidote are a bike that I would love to ride. But I think that those antidotes seem to be an incredible refinement, you know?
Well, the thing is, right?
Maybe not something that has smashed boundaries in the same way that.
Well, it has.
those
I
Mondrakers have.
disagree with you. Totally
Okay.
disagree with you, because a lot of the time we think that the best bikes in the world are the bikes ridden by the world champions, the World Cup winners, and that is obviously true to a certain degree. But there are brands out there doing some super cool stuff.
Oh yeah,
And the Antidote is probably one of the best mountain bikes I've ever ridden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
what I'm getting away from.
No, I'm going to arbitrarily decide after each one of these sections
Yeah.
who the winner is. And I think in terms of geometry, Mondraker have, changed things.
I think they opened everyone's eyes, I think, to what the future is going to hold.
What you have to bear in mind there, though, with Mondraker, a lot of that process began with Fabian when he did the Kona bikes in 2004, 2005.
But ultimately, it was still them as a brand. That
it was it was a combination of Paul Walton and Fabian who made those changes. They were very radical changes. So
they're famous for that.
I think in my decision, the way that it's affected the consumer's experience of mountain biking, and you look at big brands now like Commencal, so many brands are going direct. I think YT, I think they really, really were. And so I'm going to say the most progressive brand, in my opinion.
They changed the whole business model of how we buy bikes.
They ripped it to shreds.
It was great news for everybody. They made mountain bikes affordable to so many people, right?
So there we have it, our first category of the most kind of forward-thinking brands. Often when we think of that, it's interestingly enough, YT perhaps have done it for their disregard of the model of what a mountain bike brand should be as much as their bikes themselves. But let's talk about the bikes themselves. The trail/enduro bike of the decade, the most important one. Not necessarily the all-and-out best, but the most important one. I'll start with you, Steve.
Do you know what? I don't really think much has changed in the last decade. I'm sure Doddy will disagree with that. I think overall, when you look at, I'll judge it all. I'll judge everything on performance, which is contrary to what you say. Mm-hmm. I think it has to be performance. If you're charging big prices, there has to be a performance advantage of that bike. And I think a lot of the time we associate stiffness with speed. I think that is actually far from the truth. So we've been wrapped up in these kind of super stiff carbon bikes and stuff, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I think the Specialized Enduro was a benchmark bike of the 2000s. Mm-hmm. I think the Enduro, the 29-inch Enduro with 160mm travel, I think it is a very important bike of this decade as well, I think.
Yeah, interestingly enough, just to talk about some of those points you raised, I remember, I believe, seeing some of your work in the past talking about stiffness of wheels, snaking through things.
Yeah, we were going to that. Yeah,
yeah. I'm sure that all in good time.
I'll come into that a minute later.
And I think you're totally right. I think the bike industry, we arbitrarily say things are 15% stiffer than what and in which direction. Yeah. And there's no actual standardization of that.
Can I actually tell you guys a true story that actually happened? Right now, I was invited to a press conference in. It was in France, maybe not that long ago actually, and I'd spoken to the designers of this particular bike before the press conference and blah blah blah, and they said yes, okay, well this bike is now X amount stiffer and stronger than the previous model. And I was like, after I didn't say anything in front of everybody else, and I went back later and I said, guys, you just said the opposite to what you told me before the meeting, and this is true. They said, well, the journalists want to hear that it's stiffer and stronger. Sure. I was absolutely gobsmacked. I was like, you just lied to the world's press.
Yeah.
It's like,
but there's no way that people can
and it's a seriously big brand.
Yeah, but there's no way that as you can really test that. Do you know what I mean? Because they say that it's 15% stiffer. But where? You know what I mean? Unless you have a jig that can test, because they could always hide and say, well, actually, it was in that one you didn't try, and it's so hard.
But Doddy,
I've got a couple of options here, and the first one, going a completely different tangent to yours, I'm going to say the Santa Cruz Bronson. Right, hear me out here, because the early ones, the geometry by today's standards is almost laughable. They've even progressed massively, but the Bronson changed what we think an enduro or trail bike actually is. When those first Bronsons came out, the carbon Bronson with the NV wheels with the matching decals and the XTR, suddenly a $5,000 bike became almost socially acceptable. And before then it wasn't. That was road bike territory only. And for the first time it came into mountain biking, it changed the entire market, I think.
Can I ask you what it changed, Doddy?
It made people think differently about bike branding, about how you perceive what is acceptable in terms of pricing.
Or at least they
And
made
it
you think that.
Well, no, it opened the doors for many other brands to make cheap versions.
Well, I think I would like
Cheap
to...
carbon rims, cheap alloy rims.
I'd like to just interject, and I think that when we talk about people maybe listening, talk about Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
And I think Santa Cruz has done something very interesting in the past 10 years, is they managed to keep their prestigious status as a brand, but also they're far more common. And I do see what you're talking about. I think the Bronson in itself, I think let's not get bogged down in the bike itself, because it did have its very kind of...
Well,
We're talking about an
Henry.
important bike.
You
We're
have
not talking
to.
about the specifics
There has
here.
got to be a performance advantage to charge that money.
Yeah, well...
That's
And
not
what is
That's
the
not what my point was.
So you're
That's not
talking.
what his
So you're
point
talking
is.
about branding then.
I'm talking absolutely. It's
Right.
about what's perceptible
Yeah.
as acceptable in mountain biking.
Yeah.
It's very different. But the
Would
opposite
Yeti
end,
doing that as well,
Hold
though?
on, hear me out. I haven't finished. The opposite end of that, I was going to say the YT Capra
100%. Yeah. Well, there you go.
for completely different
Yeah,
reasons,
yeah.
and that was almost spawned off the back of what Santa Cruz opened up.
Yeah.
You had to have that for someone else to realise. Hold on a second. Why does it cost this much?
Yeah.
Why can't we sell direct?
Yeah. 100%.
You know, you have to have these things happen.
Yeah.
And that's why both of them, I think, are really important bikes.
I totally agree with you. I mean, people buy bikes on what they look like, right? A lot of people don't buy bikes on performance. I mean, you could talk about suspension between a Lyric and a Fox 36. How many people know the difference between the two? Maybe 2% of people. But I'm going to bring in a performance thing to this conversation as well. And I think Starling, which is a British brand from Bristol, they make a steel bike, 150 mil travel. And I put, when I was doing testing, I put things against the clock just to, and I think when you're buying a bike, I think fatigue is a really important thing. And it's easy to measure, actually. Like I did a test in
As in rider fatigue.
yeah, so rider fatigue. I was in northern Italy once, and I had a bike from a brand, which is built in carbon, and a bike, same brand, exactly the same bike, same components, in aluminium, and the aluminium bike was so much more comfortable when you're riding it. So, yeah, I think the comfort is important. I think when I rode the Starling bike, it was so comfortable, and I was doing like big, long 10-minute downhill runs, and I was like, against some of the carbon bikes, I was like, wow, this feels really comfortable. So Starling for me on the list.
Now, I want to bring maybe a few bikes that we haven't spoken about, but I think were quite important. In the trail bike enduro category, I want to think about some of those bikes, such as, that kind of first wave, maybe second wave of 29ers that were actually very, very they were the first bikes to properly dial it in. Like, obviously there was enduro, but then the next kind of thing, we talk about the Trek Slash.
Beautiful bike, isn't it?
Yeah, and bikes actually where people suddenly you saw a bike and 29 wheels didn't look stupid anymore. And I think that was actually quite an important part. Aesthetically, it does matter to people.
But the Specialized came before that.
That's totally.
quite some time before that. And I don't actually subscribe to the whole chainstay thing with 29-inch wheels. I think people say short chainstays are better. They're not better. They're just different. It just gives you a different feel. That's all it is really. But I think they made a 29-inch bike that was really cool and it was really fun to ride and great bike.
I think for what that bike did. It gave legs to the 29er movement. And
it kind of happened earlier as well. I mean, it became more acceptable because Trek did it.
Yeah,
Norco did it in 2012.
They had a great bike. There's a great bike. But actually, it was actually the Shinobi that I'm sure we rode at the same time, didn't we? And it was like, oh my God, this bike feels amazing.
So that bike in 2012, when people were still struggling with 29s and people were still on 135 on the back end, it had 142.
Yeah.
It had 120 out back, 140 up front.
We're talking Shinobi now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with
And
you,
it's
Doddy. I think it was a
phenomenal.
great bike. It was
And
and
that bike was so good, it went under everyone's radar, and even Norco didn't really know what to do with it. They just kind of kept it there.
Yeah.
And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, actually, you can have a 29er with more travel.
because Trek had the Rumblefish,
they were
right?
arguably
Was it
first.
Rumblefish? It was the Rumblefish,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
so, yeah.
So Trek had the Rumblefish.
Well, it's fishy, really, wasn't it?
And it was fast, but it wasn't fun, and that's the whole point, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that 29er
But
brought
the Slash is an amazing bike.
the enduro predated it, but that I think, when I decide, I think that probably is.
The thing is, right,
Go on.
think about it, the the Slash probably did what the Bronson did. It was visually amazing.
100%, yeah.
And it brought the 29-inch wheels, which was great, and it was fast. It was it was a phenomenally great-looking bike, wasn't it?
Dare I say, they put Trek back in the cool camp as
I
well.
think so.
So over the years, Trek and Specialised kind of gone up and down a bit, the PC Mac thing, and the Slash was one of the coolest bikes that they'd launched.
When talking about, like I said, choosing between your suggestions, I honestly, for some reason, I was averse to those first generation Bronsons. I really just was not.
I didn't like the VPP. I didn't like the way the road.
It was too. We talk about stiff and flex. Now, if you want to ride a bike that's stiff in the wrong places and flexy in the wrong places, it was a very complicated bike to ride, I think.
Yeah.
I think that for me, the Enduro 29 was a very important step to the Enduro bikes we're riding today. And for that reason, I'm going to put it down as the Enduro bike of the decade.
Boom!
So let's talk about the real exciting stuff, or at least for me, the downhill bikes. Steve, let's start with you this time.
Let's start with Doddy. Downhill bikes. For me, it's a very, very easy conversation. Ooh. It's the antidote from southern Poland. Like I said earlier, a guy called George Dabrowski, he makes prosthetics for, that's his main job, but it's a really niche brand, and it comes down to speed. And I was riding this bike and I was thinking, holy shit, this bike is seriously fast.
Special.
Like seriously fast. And so I phoned up Muldoon from MBR, who I wanted to get a second opinion on it. I said, Muldoon, can you get down? I need you to ride this bike. And he rode it and he goes, oh, it's easy. You got the wrong tyres. You got hard compound tyres. That's why it's so fast. I said, no, I'm not. There's soft compound tyres in it. And like this massive conversation. We couldn't shaking our heads. Why is it so fast? And so we brought in 3 other top-end bikes, like, the cream of what, certainly what people perceive as being the best. And this bike just absolutely took them apart. I mean, he was so composed. And I think it comes down to, like what I mentioned earlier, getting that flex and stiffness balance correct on a bike. And when you rode that bike, it was like such a dream to ride. And think of the materials. Obviously, there was like Kevlar and Vectran. Is it Vectran involved?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think so.
Age of Vectran.
Yeah, and it's like, and they're all individually made. They had the shock from Franco Fratton EXT in Italy. Yeah. So I think it was, for me, that was the bike.
I mean, incredibly strong argument. You seem to be very passionate about these bikes.
Well,
but what? Why then? And I'm just being devil's advocate here because I think they're fantastic. Mm-hmm. Why then haven't? I mean, actually, no, I'm not going to ask that question.
No, that's good. I know you're going to come.
I was going to say, why didn't you see more of them, or why aren't they more popular?
Because they're a very tiny brand.
brand.
Okay, look, it's like this. When I went to Olin's, I don't know, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
I said, guys, you need to get these shocks on top level bikes, and they said to me, it's recorded somewhere, you'll see it. They said, we will never ever pay a brand to use our suspension, and here we are, I don't know, 5 years later, and the World Cup Loic Bruni is on Olin's. So similarly, that's an example of it's actually not a small brand, it's actually a big brand, but in mountain bike terms, Olin's was a small brand. And yeah, Antidote, it's a tiny company, but it's a very niche company. Those guys know what they're doing. They've got massive experience of carbon. Like I said, they make those prosthetics and stuff like that. They know how things feel. And like I said, just because a bike wins a World Cup Series, it doesn't mean it says it's the best bike.
And also, what bike are they actually running on that World Cup Series? What jiggery pokery is going on behind the scenes that maybe the consumer doesn't have access to?
Yeah.
So, Doddy, what would be your submission?
Completely different angle again to Steve. So, obviously, Steve's background is downhill and working with Dirt Magazine doing that. My background is working on mass market stuff, and I always think about the consumer here. So there would be 2 main options. YT, as we've already discussed, for essentially pioneering a really affordable high-tech bike. But actually, I would say the Giant Glory.
Ooh, yeah, that was popular bike, wasn't it?
Because Giant, they're
Great
cheap,
show.
They've got amazing warranty, and they work. All right, it might not be the fastest, might not be the best looking, but you buy a Glory, you are set.
2015, that Glory came out, I believe. Maybe even the winter of 2014.
Maybe a touch earlier, but around that,
470 reach and a large, which is healthy. It had I think 440 chainstays maybe. So it was it was really, really good size.
Yeah.
Maestro kind of proven pedigree. And a privateer race bike.
Doddy, I 100% agree with you. I mean, when I rode the Glory, fantastic bike.
And also, if we
Beautiful.
take pure performance out of it for a minute, you've got to think also that downhill, It's
Yeah.
big, but it's still quite niche. It's a very
Yeah.
specific bike.
Yeah.
And to give people the opportunity to get on a bike that's World Cup capable, like,
Yeah. Danny Hart's one on
Right.
that.
Danny Hart. So Danny Hart won on the 26.
yeah.
The 650, I believe, is the bike you're referring to.
Well, no, to be fair, I'm talking about
The general.
glory,
Well, if you
the
go-
whole
If you've
glory
got-
category.
they've made the privateers bikes, for decades.
decades,
The ATX1 in the 1990s and all versions of the glory.
That model bike has always been value, performance,
Yeah.
and
Totally.
almost unbeatable for what you pay.
Can I say one thing before I forget?
Go on.
Right.
Why not treat
There is
yourself there, Steve?
only one game changer. I mean, the Antidote's amazing performance. Yeah, the Glory's privateer bike. There is only one bike that changed the game. And that is Jeff Stieber's 29-inch Intense from 2009.
Yeah.
So there you go, right back 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And it took the downhill world 7 years to cotton on to that. I mean, Santa Cruz, Fairviews, Santa Cruz, they turned up in Lords in 2017. 17 with the 20. You were working.
Yeah.
You were there then, weren't you? And they said, right, we're gonna do it. But that whole process was began by Jeff Stieber in 2009.
Do you think something like the Trek session, which possibly, and I'm going to say this because it went super light, and then people said, actually, I mean, we talk about the Mondraker as well, but I think the Trek did it in quite a public way. They went super light with those OCLV carbon when Aaron Green was riding it, and they got it down to, it was like 30, low 30s.
Well, actually,
and I think people realised that maybe having a downhill bike that was as light as it possibly could be wasn't the be-all and end-all.
No.
And I think that changed the context.
So I actually rode the pre-production versions of both the Trek sessions. I rode the 20, what was it called? In 2008.
Oh, it was
It was the first,
yes.
anyway, it was the first bike. Anyway, they built their own one.
The high pivot one.
They built, no, the one after, the first one of the current sort of style.
Yeah.
31 pounds.
Yeah.
And they decided it was too light. And when you're talking about weight, it's really, so one guy who totally believes weight is important on downhill bike is Nico Voulios. He believes 35 pound is a sweet spot for downhill bikes. I just wonder how he got in this conversation weight.
I'm talking about how Trek maybe went to an extreme place,
Yeah.
which then changed the context of the argument because everyone was like, maybe we don't need to chase weight, we can put our resources to other things. And I think that is important. If you look at those commensals, I don't think have any intention of being that light.
No.
They're not heavy, but the
They focus
privateer
on the
bike of
performance
choice.
first, and then it gets
The
to that.
current
Yeah.
Commensal 29 downhill is an absolute...
It's a beast, isn't it? I've got that on my list, actually, as a more modern.
Yeah.
It's actually
yeah.
the last downhill bike. I think it was the last downhill bike I rode at Dirt. That was. It was Amory Piron's bike.
Yeah.
It was absolutely
Really
sensational.
quite
I love the fact that's high pivot using its best
Yeah.
orientation.
Yeah.
Like, downhill for pure forward momentum.
I think so. Yeah.
So I think on the strength of what you said about the Giant, though, the Glory, I think, brought downhill
All about the monetary
downhill
stuff,
to
isn't it?
the people.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely
Yeah.
got to go in.
won't argue with that, don't I?
Now, the most important moving suspension component of the decade. Now, there is a right answer for this, and I've got it in my mind. So no pressure. Off you go.
After you done it.
RockShox Pike.
That's the right answer.
Yeah.
It
So the
changed geometry as well.
So the pre 2010 Pike was an amazing fork. We had the U-turn on it, the little 32mm stanchions. I had a coil one, and I had a one that wasn't U-turn. It had their dual air,
Yep.
so you could adjust the negative chamber, and that was phenomenal. It was just a bit small and a bit weedy. And then when the later one came out, I think 2013, around there, that changed everything.
Before we really get this loving started,
Yeah.
Steve, do you have anything you want to do to disrupt proceedings?
No, I mean, I remember having the Pike on, I think on a Yeti hardtail. I think.
I can't remember what bike I first had it on, but
I think the Pike came to the mass market with the black fork legs, etc.,
Yeah, yeah.
etc., in 2013, I think.
yeah, I thought it was about that.
No.
Yeah.
2013?
Yeah, no, the original Pike that I just referenced was way sooner.
way back.
That's
But,
what
but,
that's
but the one I'm talking about for the last decade was 2013.
charge
Oh,
down
because
side.
last decade.
The all black
Sorry,
with the
sorry,
fast
right,
black
right.
uppers,
Yeah.
35mm stanchions.
Yeah.
I think the reason for me it's important is the fact that it suddenly opened up a lot of geometry options on trail bikes. Because before you'd get bikes...
Hold on.
No, hear me out. Let me finish my point. Before you'd get bikes for the mass market, and they tried a 66-degree head angle, which now isn't extreme, but they put a 32 fork on at like 150.
Yeah.
It was like wet spaghetti. It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And or you'd go lyric, but that was too heavy. I think
It was
Pike
also
gave a good centre
it
ground.
could cross categories as well.
Yeah.
For the first time, it was light enough that you could ride it for trail. It was tough enough for enduro before enduro started going too ballistic and
Yeah.
needing a bigger fork. At the time, it was incredible, absolutely amazing.
It was a very nice off-the-shelf fork.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean,
In all orientations.
It wasn't game-changing, I don't think. I think
it was.
if you're looking at game-changing, you're looking again like the small niche brands. I think EXT, a guy called Franco Fratton from Northern Italy, massive experience of WRC, but he came out with EXT shock.
Yeah, that story.
A low pressure system, and when I put it on a demo bike, I was like, "What the hell is going on here?" Like the grip, like absolutely off the charts, and not everybody's cup of tea though, because we like to ride bikes that are fun, they're easy to move around and stuff like that. This bike was this shock was a tires on the ground shock.
Yeah,
simple as that. And if you're looking for speed and grip, there is no comparison.
I mean, I think something like a product like that is really important, but it sits on the periphery and pulls the market a certain way, just through its own excellence, basically.
Yeah.
But something like the Pike delivers it to the market.
Well, no, it's a shock that's available. The thing is, it's a very niche thing, but I think...
Can I chuck in something else?
Yeah.
Just again, like I'll always be devil's advocate with you here. So you're going pure performance. I get that, and that EXT is something special. But the thing I love about the Pike is there was a Pike for everyone. You could have the expensive damper. You could have the cheap damper.
Yeah.
You could have 29. You could have 650. You could have 26. Different travel options.
I 100%. I don't disagree with you.
Offered everyone a kind of taste of that Pike.
I don't disagree with you at all.
Now, there's one part, even though I do believe it's the Pike.
Oh, same category.
Fine.
Same category. Yeah. Now, even though I do believe it is the Pike, what about internally routed dropper seat posts? Because we wouldn't be able to get long length.
Is that a suspension component though? That's just a component, surely.
I think that's a moving suspension.
It's actually
got
the first thing.
System.
But
It's got an IFP.
Dropper post first thing on my list. But I didn't know we were talking about that. Yeah, 100%. Got to be. I mean, change everything.
There's not suspension, and the dropper post came out. Actually, the Revo were the first people to do the hydraulic one. Was earlier, yeah.
Yeah, but the poor guys that made the first dropper post, the American. What was it called? The first company?
Gravity Dropper.
I mean, they started it, and like in typical mountain bike fashion, a whole tidal wave of brands thought, yeah, let's go make some droppers. Yeah, look at that one, blah, 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 blah. But it was the Gravity Dropper guys, they started it off, right?
Yeah.
Take your hat off.
Well, actually,
I'm going
no.
to take my hat. Was it not them?
Well, no, technically, it goes...
Tip a hat to hat dropper.
Just for the audio viewer at home,
tip a
Steve
hat.
is quite literally tipping
Tip
a
a hat to the...
and also for the audio viewer at home, I'm about to correct Steve. That technically, the first dropper was by Joe Breeze. Yeah.
Okay, right. Whoever it was then.
Good on him.
That was just a spring.
Another hat.
But it enabled you to...
Another hat. Joe Breeze.
For the audio,
after Joe
for the audio
Breeze.
listener at home, he's got a second hat.
It was Breeze and Angel Engineering, actually, that did it. And that enabled everyone to drop a post and raise it again.
Yeah.
And obviously the telescopic versions came much later.
Yeah.
But it was them that opened the door to, why can't you just slam it down and bring it back up?
It's great stuff.
Okay, so the Pike is going in because of the difficult grey area the dropper finds itself in, about which decade, how long it's been about. But I think the internally routed dropper was an important refinement.
I agree. Yes, great.
Now, the most
do the
important piece of wheel and tyre tech. So we're talking tyres, rims, hubs.
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone's very eager to say Boost 148 because that just changed everything.
What about Super Boost? Said no one.
Who wants to jump on this? A live grenade.
I've got a great one
Go
to
on,
jump
Doddy.
in here. I kind of got two. The most important one, I think, is UST, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, straight in.
Why would you go for that one?
Because it was the first tubeless system.
Yeah.
And it's just been refined over the years. The fact it's got sealed rim beds, that is really the key to it working. Everyone says tubeless compatible, and you're like, no, you're just putting rim tape on.
Now, I agree with you. I think UST is really important. But why are we seeing so many brands move away from UST as we close out?
Production costs.
Is that simple as
Because
that?
you can get around it by using rim tape,
Yeah.
but that doesn't make your rim tubeless compatible.
So what would you have to do to design to make, I mean, if you could just talk through the design limitations of a UST rim, that would really help for the viewer at home, perhaps.
Yeah, okay. So on a typical rim, you would lace it up to the spokes by dropping the nipples through a hole in the rim, basically. Yeah. And you get different rims. You get double wall, single walls, and all that sort of stuff. And what Mavic developed, I think it was with Hutchinson and perhaps Michelin, might be incorrect in this. I forget the date as well, to be honest. But what they started developing was a rim system that had a sealed rim bed. and had a slightly different hook design, but it wasn't that much different. And then a tyre technology that enabled you to keep air in there without an inner tube, basically, and then use a tyre sealant to fix any holes.
Now, I think this was really important. I think tubeless tech has come along massively.
But my next thing was kind of along that basis, and it's hookless rim designs.
Ooh, yeah, that is very good.
Enabled you to still make a light rim that was strong.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about necessarily carbon here. The one I've listed was an Ibis 741. It's just one of the first ones I happened to ride by chance. And actually that rim was insanely stiff, which wasn't my preference. I preferred a rim that's got a little bit of flex to it, a bit more comfort. But the hookless rim design enables you to put a lot more strength in the rim, get a lot more durability, basically, and it doesn't affect how the tyre is held on.
Okay.
And I think that's a really cool piece of tech.
For me, Henry, it's actually incredibly simple. Now, for me, I think bicycle products should be about rider comfort and speed. Mm-hmm. So I took 15 29-inch wheel, 150mm travel enduro bikes down a 6-minute track, and we had 3 riders testing the bikes, an 18-year-old, a 35-year-old, and me, who is not 27, 50. And one bike was consistently faster, and we were trying to work out why was this bike faster and why was it comfortable. And it came down to the fact that it had a 24-spoke front wheel. And we put that wheel onto the bike. So you're like, oh shit, it's as simple as that.
Comfort.
As simple as that. Yeah. 24-spoke front wheel.
You said a word that I think is really important.
And it was alloy as well.
And I think that it actually doesn't even sit in the vernacular of many mountain bikers. Comfort. People think...
Comfort and speed.
But comfort in general.
You need comfort to get speed.
People think, oh, just hold on. You know what I mean? I think the stiff.
Yeah.
Stiff.
Yeah, I mean,
not everyone is Aaron Gwyn.
Well, I think only one person's Aaron Gwyn.
You know, people have become associated with stiffness with speed, which is absolutely incorrect. You know, especially on a mountain bike.
But do you not find it strange? And just talking about wheel tech, and I think that there are certain companies that are really on a good path now. I think of those Zip wheels. I think of Ibis wheels. But damping. People want to put a super high-tech damper in their bike, which is great. Good on them. I mean, we talk about, increasing more oil flow, all this. We're going back to coil IFPs. We're talking about coil forks and coil shocks. But the suspension unit can only work off the feedback given to it by the wheel and the tyre. If the tyre and the wheel are giving it a spike, that is not what the suspension unit wants to deal with. If it's just taking the edge off.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be careful. I mean, a lot of people ride mountain bikes for different reasons. I've primarily been riding like downhill and enduro style riding. But I guess if you ride smooth single track, you might actually want something different. So.
Yeah, no, it's very true.
Yeah.
But would there be... So your kind of most important piece of wheel and tyre tech of the decade is basically moving away from super stiff rims.
It comes back to getting... What I started the whole discussion off with is getting the right flex and stiffness balance correct. That, for me, is the most important tech you can get on a mountain bike.
And going forward into the next decade, what do you think is the best way to proceed? Because do you think it's actually we need to change the language in which we talk about?
I'll tell you what it is. I'll tell you what's happening is like a lot of these bikes and wheels and components are actually not so much the components. They're designed on screens, and we go from the design to one prototype to production in the Far East. What doesn't happen with loads of brands is they go design, prototype, test, get the feeling right on these things, time it, make sure, these things, it's not just a feeling, it's actually a fact. Yeah. These things are faster. So for me, I think that's important. Some brands are doing it.
I rode a set of quite carbon wheels recently, aggressive carbon trail enduro wheels. And they came from the factory with thread-locked nipples, which is fine. I'm not for or against that. So from that, I don't think that wheel is probably ever really going to lose tension through your average rider's use. The performance was so vastly improved by taking half a turn of tension off each wheel. I mean, literally to the point where it changed the characteristics of the whole bike.
I can completely imagine. Yeah. You think, look, 2 or 3 PSI in your tyre could do that as well. And all these marginal gains you can make, it can be undone massively.
Absolutely incredible. Let's talk about tyres. At the start of the decade, I think there was only a few choices in terms of what you'd actually see when push came to shove on a World Cup circuit. People were reaching for their minions. Specialized gave it a good shot in the early part of the decade. They did the Storm, the Butcher, the Hillbilly, some really good tyres. Yeah. at the end of the decade, there's a lot more divergence in brands. We're seeing, even with things like companies that were really big, had like a 90s heyday, like Kenda, and now making
Michelin.
World Cup winning rubber. Michelin, Enduro World Series winning rubber. We talk about the ever-present, such as Maxxis or Schwalbe. Do you think tyres have changed much in the past decade, or do you think more people are doing the good stuff?
I remember riding the Michelin Comp 16s in 1996, 97.
What a tyre that was.
Insane. I mean that changed
Later
the game.
called the DH16, isn't it?
Changed the game forever.
yeah.
And I don't think a tyre today is any better than the Comp 16 from 1997.
What about a tyre like...
Whoa!
Completely wrong.
What about a tyre that has brought something like Cut Spike to the masses, the Shorty?
Yeah,
I love the
that's
Shorty.
That's a great tyre.
The Shorty.
Well, it's probably my favourite tyre.
It's one of the, I think, something that you can do. It's not great in the bike park, but it's not terrible either.
But remember, Henry, the Specialized had the Hillbilly before the Shorty.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Can I just jump back to that Michelin thing for a second?
Yeah.
Right, so I completely agree with you. The Comp 16, probably one of my favourite tyres of all time. Right,
Yeah.
phenomenal. It was slow though. Yeah, it was really heavy as well. And tyre tech has changed that. So you can have tyres now that are as grippy. Just forget tread out
Cue
of it.
Doddy's
Wait a
visit to the
second.
Far East.
Right, hold on. but there's also other things, and you've both been talking. You've both been talking about the similarities and the problems and differences with stiffness of things.
Yeah.
And there's something you get on tyres now that you didn't used to have. Things called elastic stroke. Yeah, and that changes the comfort and the traction you have.
Henry, should we just get our coat?
Tyre tech is better than it's ever been, but that still was a phenomenal tyre. But they're clearly doing it right because they've got that DH22 now.
What brand are you talking about here?
Michelin, again, same
Okay,
brand.
right.
Yeah.
What-
Right. And that DH22, I think if you put that against the 16, it will piss all over it.
Yeah, it will
Right.
actually.
But the 16 was
I'll
phenomenal.
backtrack.
And the 24 as well, the Transalp. That was also a hell of a tyre.
What about something like the DH2, the Minion DHR2? Sorry.
Yeah, great tyre.
I mean, that is something that you
Good
see
on the front as well, to be
crop up
fair.
So-
on a lot of bikes.
Well, I'll say something regarding that tyre. I'm surprised that, I mean, comfort and speed go hand in hand, right? Because like a lot of people, a lot of racers say, "Oh, arm pump, blah blah blah," and I think that's because of the overly stiff bikes a lot of the time, and maybe bad suspension. I'm surprised World Cup downhill riders do not use 2.6 and 2.8 tyres, which will just go brum, straight through all those rocks and roots. All they need to do is make it the same weight but the same stiffness sidewalls.
There goes the problem, though.
Yeah.
That is such a hard thing to do, which is why we've seen the 2.6 rise
Yeah.
and the 2.8 kind of
Yeah, so
disappear.
that's you asked me what I'd like to see in the next decade.
I think it will get there
Yeah.
with the tech, with things we've seen. Because you think like Wyatt Beads used to be the one, and now it's Kevlar foldings
but
even for
actually
downhill.
being quite specific to downhill here, not to general
Yeah,
riding.
yes.
So,
No.
but yeah.
So I think the most important piece of wheel or tyre tech has to be, in my opinion, I think it's this moving away from the ultra stiff setups.
Yeah.
Because I think it's going to help people in ways they didn't even contemplate.
Yeah.
The most important drivetrain, either component or kind of setup.
Unfortunately, that's really easy for me.
Me too.
It's when SRAM launched XX1 1x11.
Yeah, I put
because
down.
when they did that, they had the 1x chainring, the X-Sync.
So I put down narrow wide chainring.
Yeah, okay.
It's
So there's
same
that.
thing, right?
Yeah. And really, they would. I mean, there were other chainrings floating around, but they were the first people to have a full transmission.
Yeah.
So to do that, to get the 11 speed, they had to redesign a cassette. The way that was designed, that was phenomenal.
Yeah.
The driver body to fit that, but it's all about the chainring and what that's enabled suspension designers to do.
Yeah,
So do you remember with double and triple,
Yeah.
all those wonky pivots and tiny?
yeah.
It's just horrible.
I wasn't so worried
And that's
about
just
because I wasn't so worried about the gears and the cassette and everything. I think the
what else it
chain,
does.
the chain ring was it changed.
Yeah.
Stuff.
And also-
Sure. That's what
the
I mean,
clutch
like by having the one by.
Yeah.
The clutch mech. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think SRAM really did knock it out. And I think, I'm not going to lie, I was skeptical. I was like, please,
I kept the chain guide in my bag. I did, honestly.
I believe you still do to this day.
This can't work.
I've got a top and bottom roller just in case. But I was skeptical. I thought, listen, I need 22 teeth at the back. And also, I remember, sorry, on the front. And I remember
teeth at the
telling my friend, saying, I think I'm going to get one by drivetrain. And he said, I've got a 36-36. You only need a 1-to-1 ratio to stop complaining. And it was like, oh, okay, sorry. No, good point. And it was really limited a lot of riding. And it made people think, I think it made people ride bikes and think climbing is horrible. And actually now climbing is a far more pleasant experience.
Well, climbing's always horrible, but
It's more pleasant.
just with the all of this one by stuff, yeah. So the chain ring, no doubt, all this stuff, but there's also something else that this has led to in a really good way. So you remember when we had back in the day 3 chain rings on a bike? When you're in your outer chain ring, your suspension would feel really good. When you're in your granny ring, you tend to have loads of anti-squat. Yeah, by having a one by, all suspension manufacturers have been able to. I hate to use the word optimize their suspension based on a single chain line.
Faster, stiffer, stronger, optimize.
Yeah, but it has. It absolutely has, though. The one by system has changed everything.
That is a category.
Really
that is a category we should have this
amazing.
conversation. Which is the most optimized bike in the world? I mean, it's
no-brainer, isn't it? Can we have that after this discussion?
Or after another pint
Any
of
chance?
Guinness?
Now,
Just change the record.
I want to. I wholeheartedly agree with you. I mean, especially I think with one by chain rings you were saying, some like an early aftermarket adopter like Raceface, remember, brought out. They didn't waste any time, and it suddenly meant people were just bodging and making bikes one by.
Yeah, Renthal did as well, super fast.
What were the limitations of suspension design before? If you could just explain to the viewer, because it's all very well us saying, but if you could just explain.
That's not a quick answer.
I'll do this, right? So the first one is when you've got 3 chain rings on there, you're limited in the amount of room you have around a BB yoke of a bike. So quite often they would offset the pivot down there, or they would make the pivot shorter, in which case neither of which was an ideal compromise to make a bike handle well. Okay, people made it work, but it certainly wasn't that pretty, and there were lots of issues with flex that could be eradicated by not having to make it like that. So by having a one by system, you could make that pivot point wider. You can make the whole stance of the bike much more stable, strong and efficient. So from that point of view, amazing. And then the chain rings point of view, as I just said, in a little chain ring, you tended to have more anti-squat. So when you pedal, the bike stands up.
Yep.
Great for climbing, feels horrible in other parts of the bike. You change it into the outer chain ring, i.e. the big chain ring, and you'd have the opposite effect of that. The bike would squat and it would sit in and feel nice. But now you could tune that so you can have the optimized position for the best of both worlds based on a chain ring size. Now, it has meant, though, that some manufacturers design a bike around, say, a 30. And from my point of view, it's like, I want a 34. I don't want a 30. But, you're talking like a small amount here.
Yep.
And then with the range of gears, you've got 12 gears on the cassette these days. You think that on the higher gears, which is the smaller teeth on the cassette, you can have lower anti-squat and vice versa.
Yep.
So you can tune that with the size chain ring you pick, but it simplifies it massively, I think.
Unfortunately, I don't think all the brands have actually worked out on the balance between anti-squat and anti-rise. There's still some bikes which are dogs.
Who cares? We've got an e-bike.
Yeah. Which we should maybe mention.
Just a turbo.
Yeah, should maybe mention when it comes to
e-bikes.
what are the most progressive bike brands. I think the ones who started making e-bikes, they are arguably one of the most.
Yeah.
They are the most progressive brands. I mean, a brand like Specialized, they made e-bikes look cool with the first Levo.
Yeah, I mean,
I think we should not go into e-bikes.
Right.
That's a whole different subject.
I don't necessarily want to go into e-bikes, but I think you're right. I think e-bikes have probably a lot of the tech that people have delivered for e-bikes, and I was joking about the Fox 38 early one. I think that probably is going to be at home most on an e-bike, but it also actually gives the end consumer more choice because they can there be someone like me who on a 35mm fork is absolutely happy, as Larry on a 36 is absolutely happy, but if they do ride harder, they can then start thinking about the e-bike. I mean, we even think about drivetrains. We think about loads of things.
Well,
I think e-bike gives the consumer more choice.
Here's the bottom line. This is going to have a huge impact on technology, right?
And his SD card size.
And his SD card. I'm going to say it very quickly, right? Within 6 weeks of this conversation, there will be a 15 kilo, 150mm e-bike on the market. What is that going to do to the whole mountain bike world?
It's going to break my heart, for starters.
But let's not go into it. Let's move on. Can we just move on to something else?
Yeah. Well, it sounds by unanimous decision, the winner of the drivetrain of the decade, or at least the most innovative one, was the one by setup. And all that it came with it.
Yeah. 100%, yeah.
The designer of the decade. I'm not talking some of those, fancy catwalk shoes. I'm talking bicycles, man. But before we get there, let's talk briefly about material choice.
Yeah.
Because that obviously has a massive effect upon design.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, a guy called Joe McEwen, who's a
guest on this podcast, actually.
All right. Well, he's right. I need to watch that. But he was a carbon fiber boffin for an aeroplane company. He decided to make some mountain bikes out of steel, and he knew the right steel, the right weights, the right grades and everything like that. And he made a bike which was, for me, a game changer, basically. A mid-travel 29-inch wheel bike, which felt amazing. And it was relatively inexpensive.
Now, I'm going to make a prediction, which you're more than welcome to take me up on. £5, that by the end of this next decade, aluminium bikes will be the boutique option.
Quite possibly, yeah.
I think that it's going to get to a point where if you're doing a large run, carbon can actually be more efficient in terms of cost. And I think that it will be a case of, there's a couple of, you see it's kind of happening in road bikes a bit now. You get bikes like the Alley Sprint, which is a specialised bike, which is kind of like the criterium racer bike of choice. And it's very boutique, it's very cool, it's very edgy. And you're seeing other brands also make like the CAD from Cannondale. And I think we might start seeing that.
Well, or at least the bike brands will make us think that aluminium is the boutique brand. I mean, they're very good.
Oh my God, that's what's happened, hasn't it?
They're very good. They're very good at convincing us what we should be doing. Because it comes back to what I say. It's about performance. Can you prove that a carbon fibre bike is of higher performance than an Ali one or a steel one? No, you can't, or it's very difficult to do.
It depends on what high performance is, though, doesn't it? Really, it's too hard to quantify that.
What do you think about steel, or Doddy?
I love steel.
I think it's a great
I
material.
love steel. Titanium's probably been my favourite material for what it offers, but it's not very practical on a lot of senses. Steel, yeah. Steel's great. Alloy's great. I kind of like a bit of everything. I don't have a number one favourite thing. I love what carbon has done and what it's doing, and it's enabling designers to think about in other materials as well, off the back of the way they have to produce carbon. And I love that some manufacturers are starting to think differently about how you produce it in a time-sensitive way. Like what Ibis have been doing with like using less pieces of carbon and a much shorter process.
Why is it, do you think, that some of the most progressive brands currently sort of making bikes? So yeah, Starling on a boutique side. I'm thinking Pole, I'm thinking Commensal, I'm thinking Geometron.
Yeah.
Do you think it's because they're all long-haired hippies that have environmental reasons? Or do you think it's because... Why do you think that is? Like, there just seems to be a really interesting thing going on where progressive bikes, at the moment, the progressive brands seem to be using predominantly metal.
Well, there's no doubt that it's faster and easier to work with and cheaper. So that's going to help them be more progressive.
Yeah.
No one can take that away. That's no bad thing either.
Especially for
I
a
love
small
alloy.
brand, yeah.
Yeah, it's way easier to work with, for sure. Carbon takes way more commitment to be able to
Very true.
work to the same, not the same quality, but the same sort of level to produce a bike like that, and obviously a lot more foresight in doing so. I think alloy will always be king in that respect.
Yep.
Because until you can rapid prototype carbon, which I know a couple of brands are doing at the moment, and that technology will come forwards. Until that happens, I think alloy will be king.
And Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't even add anything to that, really.
Okay. Wow, Steve Jones, speechless. Never thought I'd see the day.
Especially for you, anyway. However, I'll probably there will be something I'll want to discuss in the next nomination, possibly.
Okay, so going into that, who is your designer of the decade? If we start with you, Steve.
I've actually got a podium.
Oh, lovely.
If you don't mind.
Go.
I think I'll start the podium off with Jeff Stieber, who is the owner and founder of Intense Cycles in Temecula, California.
And on that point, he's a perfect example of my last point.
Yes,
someone that makes carbon bikes. They make loads of carbon bikes, but he does all his rapid prototyping and testing himself with alloy.
Yes, very true.
So
I think, we talked about it earlier. I think the 29-inch wheel downhill bike, which he designed 10 years ago, he was ahead of the curve. Secondly, for me, would be a guy called Alan Milliard, who actually makes motorcycle stuff. Yeah. Now, Alan is a bomb maker from Eastern England. He came out...
Like dad bomb or bombs, literally bombs?
Bombs,
Oh,
yeah.
right, sorry.
However, so he made a bike with a hermetically sealed drivetrain, single-sided swinging arm, some very different damping.
Tank shock on it.
Tank shock, which is like, so basically, short story, I was doing this downhill track, it's called the 104 track, fastest time, mostly done on 200 mil travel bikes, really rocky, really hard. Rode it down there on his bike, and he told me 2 months later, he said, what I didn't tell you is that bike had 130 mil travel. I was like, what?
No.
I've also ridden this bike, and I've worked with Alan as well.
Yeah.
So this bike had no damping on the rear shock until you hit something.
I know, and it was
highly charged with nitrogen.
Yeah.
The most bonkers thing. You look at
Bonkers.
it, you're like, this cannot work.
So he tried to sell
Insane.
lots of aspects of his design to the mountain bike industry, but they couldn't do a deal. And sadly, that technology is still sitting on the shelf in Surrey.
And he is also the guy that put a V10 engine in a motorbike because people said it couldn't be done.
Sounds like an interesting character.
And he did it in his front room. No joke.
How much do you think of these weird and wonderful contraptions are sitting in basements and spare bedrooms because they haven't been able to be sold? I mean,
Wow.
You hear about things like, an example I would cite is a brand like Bionicon. Now they hear me out.
Careful here.
Now all I mean. Steve, please stop that. It's going to drive me up the wall back. Now, all I mean by that is, I don't think they are necessarily the bike I would like to ride, but they designed something, they tried to sell to the industry wasn't necessarily interested, so they built it themselves. Well, that's what I'm saying. People that make stuff to sell.
Concept was absolutely brilliant. The GOAT concept.
Yeah. Now, do you think there's a lot of things that just never see the light of day from, maybe not as wacky as Bionicon, but like this bike you're talking about, but just never really makes it because it's not viable or because the consumer maybe isn't actually ready for it?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's like my next nominee would be Franco Fratton, who's the designer of EXT shocks in Venezia, northern Italy. He came out with a shock, which is a low pressure system, like tyres on the ground, blah blah blah, and he just couldn't sell them. He just couldn't sell them. He phoned me up. He says, "What am I going to do with these shocks?" I said, "Well, I don't know." And luckily for him, it was the transition when Chris Porter of Mojo Fox, he left that position and he set up his own business and he's now selling the EXT stuff.
When you said luckily for him, I thought you were going to say the Monmouth Shikar boot of that weekend and you turned a pretty penny.
But for me, my designer of the decade is George Dabrowski from Antidote Bikes, and how he managed to get the whole system, the frame, the suspension, the geometry, unless, like I talked about earlier, he had, carbon, Vectran and Kevlar in the frame. He managed to get that stiffness flex and performance. Incredible guy, super cool guy. And it's what you say, like there's probably like maybe 10 of them in existence in the world, which is crazy. Okay. Why aren't World Cup racers riding them?
Now there's one glaring omission here. Mountain biking's very own Pep Guardiola from sunny Barcelona.
Cesar?
Who's had his fingerprints everywhere of a bike design.
Yeah, Mondraker, the Zero Suspension, Uno, Intense.
Polygon.
Even redesigned that stuff, yeah.
He's
pretty phenomenal.
Cesar is a legend. He's worked on so many things. He decided, let's not forget, that he was going to make his Uno bikes in the Far East, but he was taking too long. He wanted to do it all himself. So he went and worked out how to make carbon bikes. Yeah. I mean, how bananas is that?
Yeah,
crazy.
Yeah.
And he goes, I worked it out. And he does work it out. He's an engineer. He's a super, super intelligent guy.
And an ex-World Cup downer racer as well.
Yeah, podium World Cup downer racer, yeah.
So, obviously EXT, I think EXT are doing some really exciting things, and I don't want to take away from that.
No, that was my list.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was it in particular?
I think George Dabrowski for me is the man.
Yeah.
So I don't have
Dabrowski's going to work it out.
List. I actually agree with all of what you're saying there. Cesar, what you're saying, I had that down as well. I've got to say, shout out to Dave Weigel actually, because of Dave Weigel's suspension systems are on so many different bikes. You've got the DW Link, you've got the Delta, you've got the Orion, the split pivot.
Yep.
Right.
What's the 160 Evil bike?
The Reckoning?
Is the Reckoning?
Reckoning. Following, Reckoning.
That 160 bike, wow, that is a
the suspension's amazing.
Beautiful bike. Yeah, I do like that.
But I think the thing I like about him is he designs a suspension system that people use, and they use them in different ways to get different handling bikes.
Old Di Weigel has learned a lot himself over the last 20 years. I mean, the Iron Horse Sunday won, phenomenal under Sam Hill, but the suspension wasn't actually that good on the Iron Horse Sunday.
It was better on their trail bikes, to be fair, than on a downer bike.
He's definitely, old Di Weigel, he's learned a lot, and I like to say that Evil Reckoning is one hell of a bike.
Now, I don't feel, to be honest with you, I'm not educated enough to call the design of the decade.
Maybe put it out to the audience.
There's too many, I think.
I think if you're listening and you think maybe there's a glaring omission or somebody that you'd like to just back up, get us in the comments.
I'm sure there'll be some designers out there who are gonna chuck their hat in the ring on this one, aren't there?
Yeah. I'd be good to hear from some of them.
It would be nice to hear from you guys. Be nice to hear from you and why you think that your designing.
Yeah, this is an open invitation to designers. You can come on this podcast and pitch your cause. We'll have another conversation in a year.
and we'll probably have another pint soon, though, Doddy. Eh?
Should we bury a time capsule of our predictions?
Now, I just want to say thank you very much for listening and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah, you're round.
Big time.
God, that was a long podcast.